People think a title like this is meant to scare you. Never start a relationship after 60. It sounds harsh, almost cruel, like someone is trying to shut a door you've only just found the courage to approach. You expect me to tell you to stay alone, to settle into silence, to accept that whatever love you had has already happened and the rest is just waiting. That would be easier to hear, wouldn't it? Simpler, cleaner, a rule you could follow without thinking too hard about it. But that's not what this is. I'm not here to tell you not to love. I'm here to tell you why, for so many women, love after 60 quietly turns into something else entirely. Something that looks like companionship on the surface but feels like erosion underneath. And the most dangerous part is that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, politely, almost kindly, until one day you wake up and realize you are no longer living your life. You are maintaining someone else's. I've lived long enough to watch this pattern repeat itself so many times it no longer surprises me. It disappoints me, yes. It exhausts me, certainly. But it does not surprise me. Because once you see it clearly, once you understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of these late-in-life relationships, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In your friends, in your neighbors, maybe even in your own story. And I want to be careful here, because this is where people get defensive. This is not about hating men. It's not about bitterness or resentment or some tired argument about who did what wrong. It's about reality. It's about what happens when two people enter a relationship at a stage in life where their habits are no longer flexible, their wounds are no longer fresh, and their dependencies have had decades to solidify into something that feels permanent. By the time a man reaches 60, he is not becoming someone new. He is revealing who he has been all along, and that matters more than anyone wants to admit. I once knew a woman named Elaine. She was 67 when her husband died. They had been married for decades, the kind of marriage that wasn't flashy but was steady, predictable in the way that makes a life feel safe. After he passed, she did what many women do. She grieved quietly, thoroughly, not for attention, not for sympathy, but because grief demands to be lived through, not performed. For 2 years, Elaine rebuilt her life piece by piece. She learned things she had never needed to learn before. She figured out her finances. She fixed things around the house. She started taking long walks in the evening, not because anyone told her it was good for her, but because she realized she liked the sound of her own footsteps when no one else was around. She began to understand something that had been buried under decades of responsibility. She was capable, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, in a quiet, grounded, deeply personal way. The kind of capability that doesn't need applause. And then she met Richard. Richard was 70, recently divorced, polite, attentive. The kind of man who looks you in the eye when you speak and remembers small details about your life. He brought her flowers the 3rd time they met. He told her she was easy to talk to, that he hadn't felt this comfortable in years. And Elaine, who had spent 2 years learning how to stand on her own, felt something shift inside her. Not weakness, not desperation, just a softening, the natural human desire to share a life instead of carrying it alone. That's how it begins, not with a mistake, but with something that feels like hope. Within 3 months, Richard was spending most nights at her house. Within 5, he had a drawer in her bedroom. By the end of the year, he had effectively moved in, though no one ever formally said it out loud. It just happened, the way these things often do when no one stops to ask whether they should. At first, it felt like companionship. They ate dinner together, watched television, talked about their pasts, compared stories of marriages that had shaped them into who they were. But slowly, almost invisibly, the balance began to shift. Richard didn't cook. Not really. He could in theory, but in practice, he didn't. Elaine found herself preparing meals again, just as she had for decades. Not because he demanded it, but because someone had to do it, and she was better at it. And it was easier than watching him struggle or pretend he didn't notice. He forgot appointments, misplaced things, relied on her to remember details he insisted weren't important but somehow always became her responsibility. His life began to organize itself around her competence. And here is the part that matters. He did not think he was taking anything from her. He thought this was what a relationship looked like. And Elaine, at first, didn't think she was losing anything either. That's how subtle it is. There is no moment where a woman like her sits down and says, "Today I will give up myself." There is no agreement signed, no line crossed with full awareness. It happens in adjustments. Small ones. Reasonable ones. The kind you can explain away without much effort. She starts cooking more often because it's easier. She reminds him of things because he forgets. She reorganizes a cabinet because his way doesn't make sense. She adjusts her schedule slightly to accommodate his routines, his preferences, his habits that were formed long before she ever entered the picture. None of it feels like sacrifice in the beginning. It feels like cooperation. But cooperation, when it only flows in one direction, has another name. And it takes time before that name becomes impossible to ignore. I remember the first time Elaine said something that made me pause. We were sitting in her living room, late afternoon, that quiet hour where the light turns soft and everything feels more honest than it does at noon. She said, "It's strange. I feel busier now than I did when I lived alone. Not unhappy, not overwhelmed, just busier." And I asked her, "Doing what?" She laughed, but it wasn't a full laugh. "Oh, cooking, cleaning, keeping track of things. Normal relationship stuff." Normal. That word carries more weight than people realize. Because once something is labeled normal, it stops being questioned. Over the next year, I watched the changes settle in. She stopped taking her evening walks as often. Said she didn't want to leave Richard alone for too long, even though he never asked her to stay. She read less, painted less. The small, quiet rituals that had once belonged entirely to her began to disappear, not dramatically, but gradually. Like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice the shoreline changing. And Richard? He became more comfortable, more relaxed, more settled. His life improved in visible ways. He gained stability, routine, a sense of being cared for again. He would say things like, "Elaine takes such good care of me," with genuine appreciation in his voice. And I believe he meant it. I believe he thought he was expressing love. But there is a difference between appreciation and awareness. And he did not see what it was costing her to become the person who made his life easier. This is the part no one talks about. When older men enter relationships after 60, many of them are not looking for a partner in the way women understand partnership. They are looking for relief. Relief from loneliness, yes, but also relief from responsibility. From the quiet, daily demands of maintaining a life on their own. Because for decades, many of them never had to learn how to do that. Someone else was already doing it. And when that someone dispersed or divorced, through death, through distance, they are left not just with emotional absence, but with practical emptiness. A life that no longer functions the way it used to. So they look for connection. And what they often find is a woman who has just spent months or years proving to herself that she can stand independently. A woman who knows how to run a life. A woman who has already done the hard work. And without realizing it, they step into that life not as contributors, but as beneficiaries. Again, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, out of habit. That's what makes it so difficult to confront. Because habits don't feel like choices. They feel like reality. There's a question I've carried with me for years, and I've never heard anyone answer it in a way that fully satisfies me. Why is it that when women are left alone later in life, they tend to rebuild themselves, while men, more often than not, look for someone to rebuild life for them? It's not because women are stronger. That's too simple, and it lets everyone off the hook. It's because women have been practicing independence in invisible ways their entire lives. Even inside marriages, even inside families, they have been managing, organizing, anticipating, carrying. They have been alone in ways that don't look like loneliness from the outside. So when they are finally physically alone, They are not starting from zero. Men, on the other hand, are often encountering that level of aloneness for the first time. And instead of learning it, sitting with it, understanding it, many of them move quickly to escape it. That urgency is often mistaken for passion. It isn't. It's discomfort. And discomfort, when left unexamined, has a way of turning into dependency disguised as love. And dependency, when it's dressed up in kindness and good intentions, is one of the hardest things to recognize while you're inside it, because nothing about it looks obviously wrong. There are no raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic betrayals that force you to stop and say, "This cannot continue." Instead, there is politeness, gratitude, routine, the slow weaving together of two lives in a way that feels, on the surface, stable. That's what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't break you, it replaces you. I remember the moment Elaine realized something had shifted beyond what she could quietly accept. It wasn't a big moment. No arguments, no confrontation. Just a small, almost forgettable evening. She had planned to attend a local lecture at the library, something she used to enjoy back when her time belonged entirely to her. She mentioned it to Richard that morning, casually, as if it were just another detail in the day. He paused, then said, "Oh, I thought we might have dinner together tonight." Not a demand, not even a complaint, just a preference, gently stated. And she hesitated. That hesitation is where everything lives. Because in that pause, she wasn't deciding between a lecture and a dinner. She was deciding between herself and the version of herself that had quietly formed around him. She ended up staying home. Of course she did. It made sense. It was easier. There would be other lectures, she told herself. Other evenings. Other chances to do the things that had once mattered to her. But something about that choice lingered. Not the decision itself, but how automatic it felt. That's when awareness begins. Not with a dramatic awakening, but with a question that refuses to leave. When did this become my life? Over the next few months, the question grew louder. She began to notice patterns she had once overlooked. How often her preferences came second. How naturally she adjusted. How rarely he did. Again, not because he refused to, but because it never occurred to him that he should. That's the difference. People like to believe that imbalance in relationships comes from bad intentions. That if someone is taking more than they give, it must be because they are selfish or manipulative or consciously choosing to prioritize themselves. But more often, especially later in life, it comes from something quieter. Unexamined expectations. Richard believed he was being a good partner. He was present. He was kind. He expressed appreciation. He did the things he thought mattered. But he had never asked himself the deeper question. Am I adding to her life? Or am I simply fitting into it in a way that benefits me? And Elaine, for a long time, didn't ask herself the parallel question. Is this love, or is this familiar? Because familiarity is powerful. It feels safe, even when it costs you something. Especially when it costs you something. There's a kind of exhaustion that women carry into their later years that doesn't have a clear name. It's not just physical. It's not just emotional. It's cumulative. Years of being the one who notices, the one who remembers, the one who adjusts. So when a relationship comes along that doesn't feel chaotic or demanding, it's easy to accept it without looking too closely at the details. Peace, even an even peace, can feel like enough, until it doesn't. Elaine didn't leave all at once. People rarely do. She didn't wake up one morning with clarity and resolve and a packed suitcase waiting by the door. She started with something smaller. She went for a walk. Just one. In the evening, like she used to. She told Richard she'd be back in an hour. He nodded, distracted, comfortable in the assumption that she would return to exactly where she had been. And as she walked, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. She remembered what it felt like to move through the world without accounting for someone else's expectations. To let her thoughts unfold without interruption. To exist, even briefly, as a person who did not need to be useful in order to be valued. That's a powerful thing to remember once you've felt it. Because once you see the contrast, you can't unsee it. And that's where the real truth begins to take shape. The problem is not love after 60. The problem is entering love without awareness after 60. Because at that stage of life, the patterns are already set. The habits are already formed. The roles are already deeply ingrained. You are not starting fresh. You are stepping into something that has been decades in the making. So if a man has spent his entire life being taken care of, being supported in ways he never had to examine, being surrounded by invisible labor he never had to name, he will carry that into the next relationship. Not intentionally, but inevitably. And if a woman has spent her life adapting, accommodating, holding everything together without recognition, she will recognize those needs immediately. And without meaning to, she will begin to meet them. That's how the cycle continues. Not through force, through familiarity. And familiarity, when left unchallenged, becomes a script you follow without realizing you're allowed to rewrite it. Elaine came back from that walk quieter than usual. Not upset, not distant, just thoughtful in a way that didn't invite interruption. Richard noticed, but he didn't ask. Not because he didn't care, but because he assumed that if something needed to be said, she would say it. That assumption is another quiet fracture point. Because women like Elaine have spent a lifetime not saying things. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned how easily honesty can become inconvenience. How quickly truth can be labeled as conflict. So she didn't say anything that night, but she started paying attention to how often she adjusted before being asked, to how naturally she anticipated his needs, to how rarely he seemed to notice the effort behind the life they were now sharing. And once you start seeing that clearly, something inside you shifts in a way that is very difficult to reverse. It's not anger, at least not at first. It's recognition. Recognition of the gap between what is happening and what you once believed love would feel like at this stage of your life. Because love after 60 is supposed to be different. Lighter in some ways. More intentional. To people coming together not out of necessity, but out of choice. That's the idea. But choice requires awareness. And awareness requires a willingness to be uncomfortable long enough to ask the questions most people avoid. What am I receiving in this relationship? What am I giving? And are those two things even close to balance? Elaine started small. She stopped automatically cooking every meal. The first time she suggested they figure out dinner together, Richard looked genuinely confused. Not resistant. Not upset. Just unsure. What do you mean? He asked. I mean we can both make something, she said. Calmly. Simply. And in that moment, you could see it. The gap in experience. The years behind him where this had never been expected, never been required, never even been considered. He tried. To his credit, he did try. But effort that begins at 70 looks very different from effort that has been practiced for decades. It was awkward, inconsistent, sometimes more work for her than just doing it herself. And that's where many women give up. Because teaching someone else how to meet a standard you've carried alone for years is exhausting. It's easier to go back. Easier to say, it's fine, they'll handle it. Easier to maintain peace than to build something new. But easier and better are not the same thing. Elaine didn't give up immediately. She kept making small changes, small refusals, small invitations for him to step into a different kind of partnership. Sometimes he met her there, sometimes he didn't, and that inconsistency revealed something she could no longer ignore. He wasn't unwilling to change, but he wasn't prepared to. And at this stage of life, the difference matters more than people want to admit, because change requires energy. It requires humility. It requires the ability to sit with discomfort without escaping it. And not everyone is willing to do that work when they've already lived most of their life without needing to. That's the hard truth underneath everything you've heard today. It's not that relationships after 60 are impossible. It's that most people enter them carrying entire lifetimes of unexamined patterns. And unless those patterns are confronted directly, consciously, and consistently, they will simply recreate the same dynamics in a different house, with a different person, under a different name. Elaine left quietly. No argument. No dramatic ending. Just a conversation one morning over coffee that had gone cold while they were speaking. She said, "I think I was happier before. Not happier alone. Happier as herself. There's a difference." Richard didn't fight her on it. I think in some quiet way he understood. Not fully, not in the way she did, but enough to recognize that something real was being said. After he left, her house felt different. Not empty, restored. She went back to her walks, her books, her evenings that belonged entirely to her. And this time, there was something else underneath it all. Clarity. Not about men, not about love, but about herself. About what she was no longer willing to trade in order to avoid being alone. And that's where this all leads. Not to a rule, not to never start a relationship after 60, but to something far more demanding than that. Do not enter a relationship after 60 unless you are certain it will cost you nothing that you cannot afford to lose. Not your peace, not your independence, and certainly not yourself. Because at this stage of life, you are not building from the beginning. You are protecting what it took you decades to become. And anyone who steps into that life should be adding to it, not quietly replacing it.